The tape was not supposed to be there. It had arrived at Mate's recording studio in North Hollywood on a Tuesday morning in February 1992, tucked inside a manila envelope with no return address. Just a cassette, a handwritten label with two words, demo, unfinished, and a name scrawled in the corner that the junior engineer, a 24-year-old named Paul Greer, almost didn't recognize because the handwriting was that careless. Like the person who wrote it didn't think the name would matter. Paul set it on the shelf with the other tapes. He had 12 things to do before noon and a Stevie Wonder session starting at 2. The cassette sat there for 3 hours, leaning slightly against a reel of quarter-inch tape, anonymous and unremarkable. Stevie arrived at 1:47. He came in the way he always came in, not loudly, not with ceremony, but with a kind of forward-moving calm that made the room rearrange itself around him without anyone deciding to do that. His engineer, Dennis Fuller, had worked with him for 9 years and still couldn't explain exactly how Stevie made a room feel different just by entering it. He just did. Something about the way he listened before he moved, the way his attention reached into a space before his body did. They worked for 4 hours on a track that had been giving Stevie trouble for 2 weeks. A melody that kept folding in on itself, resolving too early, losing the grief it was supposed to carry. Stevie played it back 6 times, each time sitting very still with his head slightly tilted. The way he tilted it when he was hearing something the rest of the room had already stopped hearing. "Not yet," he said after the 6th playback. "There's something missing, and it isn't a note." Dennis didn't answer. He learned not to fill Stevie's silences with noise. By 6 p.m., they had broken through something. Not solved it, broken through it, which is different. The track breathed differently now. Stevie called for a 15-minute break and sat in the leather chair in the corner of the control room, drinking tea, saying very little. Paul was tidying the shelf behind the console when he knocked the cassette onto the floor. He picked it up, looked at it, and without fully deciding to, said, "Sorry, there's this demo tape that came in this morning. Unsigned. Someone dropped it off, I think. I haven't had a chance to log it." "Play it," Stevie said. Paul hesitated. "It's unfinished. The label says, 'Play it.'" The sound that came through the monitors first was almost nothing. A guitar, barely amplified, with a hum underneath it that Paul recognized as a ground loop. Cheap equipment, recorded somewhere that wasn't a proper studio. A bedroom, maybe, or a rehearsal space at 2 in the morning when the heat had clicked off. The kind of recording that apologizes for itself before it begins. Then the voice came in. It didn't announce itself. It didn't build toward anything. It arrived the way cold arrives, through a window you didn't know was open. Not a sudden gust, but a slow, irreversible presence that you only notice once you're already cold. The voice was singing something that didn't quite resolve into a melody yet. More like the shape of a melody, the negative space where one would eventually live. The words were half-formed, some of them placeholders, where a lyric hadn't arrived yet. But the vowels in those placeholder sounds were doing something that made Paul forget he was supposed to be logging tapes. He stood with the cassette case in his hand and didn't move. Stevie had gone very still. Not the working stillness he used when he was solving a problem. Something else. Something that happened before the solving, before the analytical mind got involved. His tea was on the armrest and he had stopped lifting it. The recording lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The guitar dropped out toward the end, leaving just the voice against room noise and a faint, unintentional reverb from whatever space it had been recorded in. The final note didn't resolve. It just stopped. The way a sentence stops when the person speaking it realizes mid-word that they don't have the ending yet. The tape ran silent. The heads kept turning. The hiss filled the room. Stevie didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said quietly and with no drama at all, "Why does that sound hurt?" Paul looked at Dennis. Dennis looked at Paul. Neither of them answered. It wasn't a rhetorical question. Stevie's head was slightly tilted again, the listening posture, as if the answer might still be present somewhere in the decaying hiss coming through the monitors. He wasn't asking for information. He was asking the way you ask when you've encountered something, and your instruments, the ones you've calibrated over decades, are giving you a reading they weren't designed for. "Rewind it," Stevie said. Paul rewound the tape. He pressed play again, And this time Stevie sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped. The position of someone who has decided to pay the full cost of attention. The voice came back through the monitors. Paul had listened to a significant quantity of music in his life. He was 24, he'd gone to recording school, he'd sat in on sessions with people whose names were in the liner notes of records he'd grown up with. He believed he had reasonably good ears, but listening to the tape again, with Stevie Wonder sitting 3 feet away paying full attention to it, he heard things in the recording that he hadn't heard the first time. Or, more precisely, he didn't hear new things. He felt things he'd registered as sound and then filed without examining them. The way the voice dropped in pitch on certain syllables, not for musical reasons, but because it was running out of breath, or will, or both. The way it pushed slightly sharp on the held notes, not from poor technique, but from something that was working against the pitch. Something the singer was feeling that made perfectly tuned notes feel dishonest. The guitar underneath it wasn't playing a chord progression so much as it was holding space, preventing silence. The way you hold someone's hand, not because you know what to say, but because the alternative is leaving them alone in the room. Stevie listened to the whole tape again without speaking. When it ended the second time, he sat back. "Who is this?" he said. Paul looked at the cassette case. The name on the label, I think it says Kurt Cobain. I'm not sure I'm reading it right. The writing is, "I know who Kurt Cobain is," Stevie said, not impatiently, with the quiet specificity of someone correcting a misunderstanding before it could develop. "I mean, who is this person? In this recording? This isn't a performance." Dennis, who had been leaning against the wall during both playbacks, said, "What is it then?" Stevie didn't answer right away. He reached out and picked up his tea, which had gone cold, and held it without drinking it. "It's what's left," he said finally, "after someone has stopped trying to make you understand." The room was quiet. Paul set the cassette down very carefully on the console, as if it had become something that required caution. Later, much later, Dennis Fuller would try to describe what had happened in the room during those two playbacks. He'd told the story in pieces over the years, at dinner tables, in interviews that never quite found the right publication, once in a long phone call with a music journalist who was writing something about the period and had tracked him down through 3 layers of industry contacts. The story was always slightly different in its details, the way honest stories are. Sometimes Paul was logging different tapes. Sometimes the break was longer. Once Dennis misremembered the month as March. But the core of it never changed, because it wasn't the kind of thing you misremember the core of. "Stevie asked us to play it a third time," Dennis would say. "And I know that sounds like nothing. Like, okay, he liked a tape. He played it again. But it wasn't that. The third time he wasn't listening the same way. He wasn't analyzing it anymore. He'd already done that. He was just being in it. Like he'd decided it deserved to be heard. By someone. Even if the person who made it never knew." The third playback happened in silence. No one moved or spoke or shifted in their chairs. The monitors played the voice and the guitar and the accidental reverb, and then the silence at the end, and the 3 of them sat in it. The hiss, the stop note, the unfinished sentence, until the tape ran out and the heads kept turning, and there was nothing left to hear. Stevie sat with his hands in his lap. He said to no one in particular, exactly what he's doing, and that's what makes it impossible to hear. Paul didn't ask what he meant. He understood it the way you understand something that doesn't require explanation, as an experience, not a proposition. He never wrote about it, not at the time. He kept the cassette. He wasn't supposed to. It was supposed to be logged and filed, and eventually someone would have come looking for it, or it would have been returned to whatever address might have been traceable from the delivery. But he kept it. He told himself it was an administrative oversight, a Tuesday morning tape that got lost in a busy session day. He kept it in the shelf above his desk at home for nearly 2 years, in a case with other tapes, not displayed, not hidden, just present. In April 1994, he took it off the shelf. He didn't play it. He sat with it in his hand for a long time, in the specific way you hold an object when you're trying to understand what it is now, what category it belongs to, what relation it has to everything else in the room. He put it back on the shelf. He didn't tell anyone about those 2 minutes for a long time. And when he finally did, at a dinner table, to a friend who'd asked how he'd gotten into recording what had made him take it seriously, he found that the story was difficult to tell, not because it was complicated, but because the most important things in it were the silences. And silences are the first things to disappear in the retelling. There was this tape, he said, and Stevie Wonder played it 3 times, and the third time nobody in the room could speak for a while after it ended. His friend waited. That's it, Paul said. That's the whole story, except it isn't, because the part you'd need to understand it is the part I can't give you. Which is what it sounded like in that room when the tape ran out, the 3 of us sitting there in the hiss. Dennis Fuller gave one interview in 2012 to a music publication marking something or other. He couldn't remember the exact occasion, an anniversary maybe, a retrospective. The journalist asked him about the most memorable session he'd worked on with Stevie Wonder. Dennis talked about the album sessions, the particular chord voicings, the way Stevie heard a mix and could identify a frequency imbalance that the meters weren't catching. He talked about the technical genius. He talked about the patience. Near the end of the interview, he mentioned the tape. The journalist, to their credit, stopped asking the prepared questions and just said, "Tell me about that." And Dennis said, "There was a voice in that recording that was doing something I didn't have a word for at the time. I still don't, really. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was more like the place sadness comes from, before it becomes a feeling, before the person feeling it has decided what to do with it." And Stevie heard that? Stevie heard things we weren't hearing. That was the whole thing about working with him. He didn't hear the sounds. He heard what the sounds were about. And that tape, he heard something in it that stopped him. A man who had heard everything, who had worked with everyone. And that 3-minute demo from a kid recording in what sounded like a basement, it stopped him. What did he say? Dennis thought about it. He said it hurt, Dennis said. He asked why it hurt, and none of us could answer him. And I've been thinking about that question for 20 years, and I still can't answer it, which I think is probably the point. Stevie Wonder, in an interview some years later, was asked about the difference between technical excellence and emotional truth in music. He answered a different question than the one he'd been asked, the way he sometimes did, following something only he could track. The hardest thing to record, is the moment right before someone has decided to survive something. Not the survival, the moment before the decision. Most people protect that in themselves. They don't let it into the room. He paused. Sometimes, he said, someone doesn't protect it. And when you hear it, really hear it, you feel it physically, not in your chest, somewhere older than your chest, somewhere you don't have a word for yet. The interviewer waited to see if he would say more. He didn't. The tape had been made in December 1991, in the front room of a house in Seattle, on a 4-track recorder that had a persistent ground hum no one had bothered to fix. The voice in it belonged to someone who was 24 years old and was not trying, at that moment, to make a record or build a career or say something that would last. He was just playing, the way you play when no one is listening, the way you make sounds to find out what you're carrying. He didn't know about the Tuesday morning in February, the manila envelope, the shelf, the session, the stillness, the third playback, the hiss at the end, the silence in the room, the question that went unanswered. He never knew, but somewhere in North Hollywood, in a studio that doesn't exist anymore, the building was converted, the console sold, the tape library dispersed. 3 people sat in a room and listened until the tape ran out. And the question hung in the air the way questions do when the person asking them already knows the answer won't come in words. Why does that sound hurt? The heads kept turning. The hiss went on.